With only 52 days until the election on November 5th, let's look into what the polls say in regards to the Senate races this upcoming November. As we all know, there is a litany of races we already know the results of, like Adam Schiff most likely beating Garvey in California, but we have plenty of swing states that we're going to look into right now. Let's first begin with what the national race is saying right now. As of right now, of course, we have Kamala Harris leading in the 7 swing states by a 0.1% amount, okay? So she's leading by 0.1%. So it's basically tied if you take it at face value. If you look over to the right of your screen, you'll notice that the national race has a lead for Harris of 1.7 percentage points. This is important because if you recall, in 2020, while Biden won more of the popular vote than what is projected for Harris, the Republicans still gained ground in the House and the lower ballot races, which really lends credence to the fact that perhaps the Republicans in the Senate are really experiencing a second wind that you didn't expect to happen. That being said, let's address the Senate races going from least likely to most likely to be noticeably different. Right now, we're starting off with 47 seats for the Republican Party and 40 seats for the Democrats. Let's go and begin with New Mexico. If you look into the stats for New Mexico, you see that the Senate race is looking really good for Martin Heinrich, who is a multi-term incumbent. In fact, he's leading Domenici by 9.5 on average. Granted, the polling has been sparse to say the least, much like the foliage in New Mexico. But that being said, of course, there really is no reason to think that Nila Domenici would really stand a chance. Whether you have a party organization that is pretty solid in New Mexico or a family name that goes back generations, it just simply doesn't matter. In today's electorate, we are talking about people that very rarely will split ballot, especially in presidential years. And so really what you're begging the question of is, if Kamala is projected to win New Mexico by, let's say, 8%, what is there to say that 1 in 5 Kamala voters are going to swap sides to vote Republican in the Senate? It just literally doesn't make sense. And so for that reason, I will believe that the polls will be accurate, in fact, because yes, the Democrats winning New Mexico is basically a shoo-in. To counterbalance those numbers, though, we do have Florida Senate race, which has Powell versus Rick Scott, and he's currently leading this person by 4.3 percentage points, and the polls are not super favorable. But I have multiple reasons to believe that it'd be a landslide victory for Rick Scott, which is something he's never experienced. That being said, the following reasons are that basically, if you look at Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio's performance in 2022, you would know that Florida was super favorable to the Republicans. And not only that, but even in 2020, despite losing the Rust Belt states, Donald Trump outperformed in Florida relative to the rest of the country. In fact, when the country voted about 5 points Democrat nationally for Biden, Trump still won Florida by 3, which means it voted R plus 8. In relative terms, that means that even if Trump were to lose the entire election by like 6 points, he'd still win Florida. And Rick Scott is not going to lose any sort of love between the Trump vote and anything else, right? So for that reason, Scott will easily win the Senate in Florida. And so when you move on, we do have some other states to cover. In Virginia, we have an election between Hung Cao, who is a former veteran, and we also have Tim Kaine, who is a multi-term incumbent senator. He's currently leading the polls by 12.2 percentage points. Again, there's no way he's going to win by that much, as that is somewhat asinine. I mean, if you look at the numbers, again, I'm trying to use a little bit of my discernment here, but you see that Tim Kaine has 51% of the vote, and Cao has an average of 38.4. So it begs the question, where's the other 12%? And the truth is that obviously there's a ton of undecideds, which will lean Republican in due time. That being said, for now, Kaine has a resounding lead. And while obviously Kaine will not win by 12, in fact, he'll probably win by, let's say, 6 or 8 or something. Truth is that it doesn't matter at that point because it's a win, right? So we do have a Democrat Virginia. Again, this could have been a different story had Biden stayed in the race and Glenn Youngkin would have been out there shilling Hung Cao, but nevertheless, it doesn't matter. So there you go. That's a Democrat, not a lead, but they're down 6 to the Republicans. It's 48-42 right now. Let's move on to Texas. Ted Cruz is currently leading Alred by about 6 percentage points, which is interesting because I've even gotten ads in Arizona for the Texas Senate campaign, which is very off-putting to me personally. So they're really spending a ton of big bucks on this campaign, which lends credence to perhaps the Democrats having a displaced sense of priorities. But that being said, we saw that in 2018, Ted Cruz had to actually fight for his life for once in the Texas political scene as he unexpectedly got almost beaten by Beto O'Rourke. Now, his campaign basically was a flash in the pan as he had a Kamala-level disaster primary run in 2019, just that he wasn't a black woman, so he wasn't picked for VP. Nevertheless, he'd be going against Trump if that were the case. But anyway, we do have Colin Allred going against Ted Cruz, and Ted is winning by several points. And Ted is already a bad candidate, to be clear. Not anything personal, but he just is unlikable at a visceral level. And it used to be worse before the facial hair. So that's a black bill reality. All right. So it's like, don't run for Senate as a sub-5 male. But as you can see here, Cruz's lead is very resounding. Again, there's not a lot of spending on the polling, as it's evidence that it's going to be another Florida where the Republican will win, whether it be by 5, by 12, it doesn't matter. Kind of like Virginia for the Democrats. So anyway, now that we are one vote away from a tie in the Senate, let's look into the state of West Virginia. Now, for whatever reason, the RCP aggregate website does not have an actual source of the polling for West Virginia, which is off-putting. But it also shows that Jim Justice, the former governor who's pretty popular there, will inevitably win the Democrat that none of you guys know the name of, because basically the Democrat Party in West Virginia is in foreclosure without Manchin running up a close race that he would lose anyhow. That being said, we do have Maryland as a sleeper, and let's look into Maryland. So Maryland, which is a state that Democrats tend to win by like 20, 35%, crazy, kind of like California if it were the size of an ant. You've got Maryland Senate really close, in fact. The polling has also Brooks, the Democrat, leading with 46.7% of the vote, so not even 50. And you have Hogan at a 42.3%. Being behind by only 4.5 percentage points, which is utterly remarkable. In fact, it's almost within the margin of error statistically. That being said, this is not going to hold through. This is me not being biased as a Republican, because although Larry Hogan was a popular governor of Maryland and he's perceived as a moderate, and he's not intimidating to Democrats, the truth is that the bottom line goes that if you're voting for Kamala, why the hell would you vote for a Republican, even if he's moderate, knowing damn well that he's going to vote, let's say 70% for Trump, and he might vote against some of the Trump things that would go on in the following 5 years. But truth being told is that obviously, why would you run that risk if you're a Democrat? And that is the question that he's asking and begging of the electorate in Maryland. Why would a third of the people voting for Kamala vote for a Republican, no matter which one it is? It just doesn't make sense. You know, most Democrats don't swing that way. Most guys wouldn't say, oh, there's a guy that's really, I'm going to swing. No, you're not, right? So logically speaking, of course, people that are Democrat, even if they think, oh, Larry Hogan's not that bad, he's just a lovable fat guy, well, guess what? They're still going to vote Democrat no matter who it is. And so even if it were Bernie Sanders, frankly, I think Maryland would go blue regardless, because again, it's an election year, which makes it virtually impossible even for a good Republican to win in a deep blue state like it would be theoretically possible in a 2010 scenario, 2014, off year election. But nevertheless, let's move on to Ohio. As seen here, Ohio is a state that has actually been narrowing down quite substantially. The lead for Sherrod Brown was somewhere around 8 points months ago. Then it was about 6 to 5% for several weeks. And then now that I check it today, his lead is down to 3.6. In fact, he only has 46.3% of the total vote. And typically, if you want to be confident as an incumbent to win, you need to have over 50%. In other words, an outright majority of the vote. In fact, Moreno is at a 42.7, with 3.6 obviously going towards Brown, towards his lead. But this is well within the margin of error, and more so, Trump is likely to win Ohio by about 10 percentage points, which lends me to think, obviously, that how the hell are you going to get 1 in 10 Trump voters to vote for Sherrod Brown? On what basis, right? Sherrod Brown voted with Biden almost all the time. And can you really think of a popular case where he didn't? And I'd give you $2 or something. And so for that reason, there's no reason logically why you could also have somebody like Larry Hogan lose and then also have Sherrod Brown win. Granted, these are closer states, like in the case of Ohio, than it is in Maryland, but still the basic logic still applies. And so when you add the numbers in this election, by the way, according to the latest polls, they only add up to about 89%. So there's still over 10% undecided vote. Will Moreno win more of that undecided vote come November? 110% yes. And also, why would a Trump voter vote for a Democrat, even if it's Sherrod Brown, who apparently fights for the working class, whatever that means? Guess what? It's still not going to work out. In fact, what happened to the last guy who was the moderate Democrat? Oh, he's a pragmatic person. He supports, these like tariffs and everything. Okay, well, Tim Ryan got shellacked by J.D. Vance, who himself was not even running a good campaign. No offense, J.D., but that proves my point. Now, this overall trend I called for several months. Of course, this was not going to stand. This whole Democrat mirage in Ohio was definitely not going to last. And so anyhow, well, yes, when you look at the field, obviously Sherrod Brown has already won 2 elections at the Senate level. But the truth is that his competition has been pretty subpar. You have Josh Mandel, who had a cross-dressing scandal, very weird. You have 2018, where he went against a guy named Jim Renacci, who nobody remembers. So you can see why he won those elections. And even beyond that, by the way, you look at 2012, he won by 6. Obama won that state pretty easily. And when you look at 2018, the Democrats had a D+8 ballot at the general level. So for him to win by 6.4 in Ohio is not this remarkable Messiah-like feat, especially against a Republican that none of us remember anyway, unless you're nerdy like myself, like the video if you remember. Anyhow, the point being is that Brown is not this juggernaut of a candidate. So when he goes down, we're lighting a cigar, the first cigar I've ever had, and we might try it on stream. So anyhow, Ohio's going Republican. That's 51 Senate seats in the majority for the Republican Party. So already they win the Senate, even if Trump loses to Kamala, which is unlikely to happen in this scenario. That being said, let's move on to Montana. So Montana here is protesting and really positing a lead for Tim Sheehy, the Republican, of 5.2 percentage points, which is honestly lowballing the Republican. That being said, Montana is a state that went about 15 points for Donald Trump in the past election. And so the question is, John Tester, who is considered a moderate Democrat who can conserve certain values, not conserve one of his fingers as that one is missing. But aside from that, he seems to be pretty pragmatic. That being said, though, when you're looking at ticket splitting, that entire premise is what really belies a lot of the future losses for these incumbents in opposing states. So for instance, in the Tester case, he would attack somebody like Sheehy by saying he's too far right or he's like this weirdo, but it doesn't really work. The Sheehy person is a pretty telegenic guy, has a record that is pretty sterling, and so there's really no reason why a Trump voter would all of a sudden make a sudden move to vote for Tester when there's really no reason to. Again, 2018, different story. Healthcare at the forefront. The economy wasn't sucking because Trump was in office, and so you had more of a rein of a looser leash for the dogs to say, okay, let's look at the blue dog Democrats for a change. But this election is completely different. It's stratified and it's polarized. And for a northern state, it gets cold out there if you're a Democrat, because come November, he's looking pretty screwed, and that is Tester. So anyway, that is an L, 110%. Again, the polls were like, oh my God, Tester's winning. This was like 6 months ago because, you know, he had no name recognition. Then Trump does one rally in Montana just on a whim, and then all of a sudden, Tim Sheehy blows up like I said he would. And I'm vindicated. So right now, 52 seats for the Republicans, 43 for the Democrats, 5 more states to go. Let's go to Wisconsin. Right now, Tammy Baldwin is leading Eric Hovde by 6 percentage points, which is a little unfortunate for the man, as he is somebody who is telegenic and also doesn't really have anything going against him that would make anybody who's voting for Trump think, oh, this guy's too far right, or this guy's like a fake, he's a rhino. That isn't the case. But what is the truth here is that Baldwin has a respectable lead over Hovde, despite the fact that Wisconsin is a purple state by any measure of the term. This is because obviously Baldwin has a name recognition advantage, which is super underrated in politics. People don't talk about this enough, maybe because they don't know who the other side's opponent is because, again, name recognition. So it's ironic. But also keep in mind that Baldwin, along with the majority of Democrats, but also inclusively and specifically in this case in Wisconsin, has a funding advantage, which makes it really difficult for somebody like Hovde to get his word out there when in reality he's getting overshadowed by Baldwin, but he's also being overshadowed by Trump in a way. So then it begs the question, if Hovde is going to have a chance, either there's got to be some external locus that would make this dynamic change, such as like a debate performance that would be stellar, which we've yet to see as we're not there yet. But also it could be that Trump's coattails drag him along on board like a stowaway for the Senate. But it just depends. For instance, if Trump were to win Wisconsin, but let's say 1%, could you reasonably ask 99.1% of Trump voters to vote for the Republican Senate candidate, even if Hovde is completely kosher? Well, it's a tough thing to ask statistically, right? Like, what are the odds that it would be that much of a correlation? You know, Trump voter to Hovde, it would literally, again, would have to be like 99.5 percentage points if Trump were to barely win Wisconsin. So it begs the question, will Trump win Wisconsin by, let's say, 4 or 3, in which case, you know, maybe Hovde does edge out Baldwin. But as of right now, I think there's too many people. And by too many, I mean there's probably like 5% of people that are voting for Trump that are just voting despite Kamala because she's too far left or because Biden's economy sucks, and not because they like Donald Trump and not because they're conservative at all. Therefore, there's no love lost for that voter to vote against Hovde for Baldwin. And so you could see a niche of Trump Baldwin voters that would screw over Hovde at the end. And so that's why for now, I think that the polls are somewhat accurate insofar as Hovde is down. So we're going to give this to Baldwin for now. Could change. But Michigan is a little more favorable for the Republicans, in my honest opinion. Slotkin is leading Mike Rogers by about 5 percentage points, so it's more narrow than Wisconsin already. But also keep in mind that it's an open seat, so the incumbency advantage does not exist. Also keep in mind that there's an external issue, a niche issue of the Middle East, and Slotkin is a Jewish Democrat that is a moderate. So if that's the case, then clearly there might be some turnout differences that you might not be able to detect in polling. That's something that we can't really read into or even quantify. It's just something that you can note in your head when election day comes. But before November, let's look into what the polling says, right? So right now, Slotkin is at 47, Rogers at 42, but also keep in mind that there's still like 10% undecided with the math here. And the undecideds will break Republican. Obviously, they always do. But keep in mind this also. Slotkin's lead is not permanent. You know, for instance, Slotkin is a couple points ahead of where Kamala is over Trump. Well, why is that the case? Well, it would probably lend to the fact that Kamala is perceived as further left than Slotkin, but how true can that be? I think that there's probably not much of a gulf between the two candidates, and it's up to Mike Rogers to make the case in Michigan so that people say that, well, you know what, if I don't like Kamala, why would I like Alyssa Slotkin? It's up to him to really figure that out. Again, funding is going to be pretty harsh as she's a good fundraiser, and so we need to see if he can figure it out before November, but the clock is ticking, and we need to see. So for now, it seems like the Democrat will win. But again, there's some things that could go awry for the Democrats. 3 things, okay? It's the Middle Eastern thing. There's also if there's a debate, that could also be something that could pop up. 3 would be if Trump, again, coattails like in Wisconsin. If he wins Michigan by enough, then any sort of Republican that's kosher will be drug along in that race. And so maybe that could happen. We don't know. Also, Pennsylvania is next. All right, so Bob Casey is leading McCormick by 3.4 percentage points, which is actually remarkable as McCormick has been down by like 7-10 points, like as of like several months ago. Like basically the entire race, he's been down by almost double digits. And Bob Casey is known as this electoral juggernaut, which in my opinion is overestimated and overstated, kind of like with Sherrod Brown. But Bob Casey, I'll give him a little more credit. Pennsylvania is definitely more purple than Ohio too, and so it's a difficult proposition to say, well, McCormick is going to win. It doesn't seem like it, in fact. So as of right now, you can see that it's not a race where one candidate has a majority of the vote. In fact, there's still plenty of undecided in the math here. In fact, there's about 9% that are still in the gray, and so it's hard to tell who's going to win. That being said, 3.4 is on the very edge of within a statistical tie. Margin of error, so to speak. So it's difficult to really give one side an advantage over the other that is concrete. It's liable to change. Now, McCormick is not this like amazing charismatic orator or anything of the sort. And also clue in also the nominal difference in fundraising and spending and ads. Democrats tend to have that advantage all the time. So really, Casey has a decent shot of retaining the seat, all things being considered. The thing that would also apply to McCormick, like it would to Hovde and to Mike Rogers in Michigan, is will the Trump coattails be enough to overcompensate for Democrats down ballot that are not as hateable and repugnant on policies and personality like is Kamala Harris? It just goes down to that. As of right now, I lean Casey in this race, but it could get close. For instance, if Trump were to beat Kamala in Pennsylvania by 5, then Casey's going to be left out of a job, and it's going to be a tough life for him going forward. But for now, it seems like if Trump wins Pennsylvania by like 1 or 2, he's not going to be dragging anybody with no coattail. And so for that reason, I think that McCormick is likely to lose the state come November at this rate. But we do have 2 more states to cover. All right, so the next state is going to be Nevada. This is a pretty hokey state to talk about, honestly, as Rosen is leading Brown by 11 points in the polls. This is not actually congruent with reality at all. In fact, the polling has not been updated in weeks. So we really need to give this one more time. But to be clear, if anybody wins, it'll be by like 3 points or less either way. So I can't really talk about this. Rosen has the clear advantage insofar as incumbency and name recognition and all of the sort of things that you would normally think would make you win the Senate. So we're going to give her the seat for now. But just keep in mind that Sam Brown will make it a lot closer, if not just win entirely. Again, the coattails question arises just like in every other swing state and when it comes to Trump and the Senate candidate. But, obviously we need to wait for more data for me to flesh that out. The final state of Arizona is somewhat interesting as well. As you can see here, you'll notice that Kari Lake is losing to Ruben Gallego by 7.3 percentage points. Again, this is really gruesome for Kari Lake. She seems to be pretty weak in this election. That being said, the polling is pretty off. But let's also include the fact that right now I've been walking into ads that basically take Carrie Lake out of context clips about abortion, being murder, and all these other things and claims, and then putting Ruben Gallego for Senate on it. And frankly, that is a kill shot. Okay, it's not a popular thing to be quoted saying those things. And however disfavorable and slanted, and people get to call it slander, but anyway, the point being is like clearly Carrie Lake is outgunned like 4-1 insofar as fundraising is concerned. And so as of right now, the trajectory is very negative for her. And so she's likely to have a Martha McSally 2.0 2020 result, which again is super nerdy. But basically, Martha McSally ran a couple points behind in the polls compared to Trump in Arizona in the last election. And she ended up losing Arizona by like 2.5, and Trump ended up almost tying basically in Arizona in 2020. And I see Carrie Lake doing about the same, where Trump could win the state by 1.5, let's say, and then Carrie loses it by 1. But as of right now, it seems like Gallego is likely to win. Things are liable to change, though, if there's debates. Carrie Lake is a great orator, but also Ruben Gallego has not been exposed as a far leftist like he is, similar in a vein to Kamala Harris, closer to Bernie Sanders and those acolytes. And so we'll see if those things tend to change the dynamic of the race going closer to November and the election season in general. But for now, it seems like Republicans are poised to win 52 Senate seats to the Democrats 48. And so for that reason alone, I believe that these polls are pretty representative of the state of the race. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't even yet, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Adios.